Just how are the conferences comparing to each other in this 2018 season of Super Rugby? This was a suggestion put to me in the comments, and I thought, yeah, let's have a look and see how things stack up. These logos don't quite match what we're getting in Super Rugby, but you know what I mean. We've got the three conferences with the 5 New Zealand teams, the 4 Aussie teams plus the Sunwolves, and the 4 South African teams plus the Jaguares. So just going to have a look at so far. So we've finished week 9. Just how have the results gone for those kind of inter-conference games? So we'll start with the New Zealand conference against the Australian conference, and this is the one that gets talked about, I think, a lot in Australia and also in New Zealand. Just that the conference has been dominated by New Zealand for the last kind of all of this season, all of last season, and much of the season before. So there have only been 4 games between New Zealand Conference and Australian Conference teams so far, and New Zealand has won all 4, so they're at 100% against Australian Conference teams so far this season. Against the South African teams, it's a bit of a different story. There have been, how many is that? 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 games. So there were a lot of people questioning why so much New Zealand v South Africa action early on and not so much the Australian stuff. I would imagine that's a question for the schedulers. I know it's hard to kind of plan the tours for the South African and the Jaguares teams just because they've got to travel so much of the world. But yeah. Anyway, so of those games, New Zealand teams have got 9 results. So that's pretty strong, So on the flip side, we've got Australia versus New Zealand at none, and South Africa versus New Zealand at 3. So yeah, I mean I suppose that's a fair state of where things are at Super Rugby at the moment. There just seems to be a barrier, whether it's mental or skill-based, between the Aussie and New Zealand teams. But the South African teams are still able to get one up over the New Zealanders from time to time. Although I should say that 2 of those 3 results against New Zealand teams were the Blues. So it was Sharks over the Blues and Stormers over the Blues. So that's whether that's an exception or not is another question. So for South Africa and Australia, there have been quite a few games. So Australian teams against South African teams, the Aussies have picked up 5 out of 10, and the South Africans have picked up 5 out of 10. So it's an interesting one that it's an even balance, and it's also interesting that whilst the Aussie teams don't have too much problem, like 50-50 getting results over the New Zealand teams. Over the South African teams. They can't do it against New Zealand teams, whereas the South African teams can, which kind of makes me think that part of it must be a mental thing. Either that or the Blues haven't played any Australian teams yet. So it's kind of one or the other. Now, I ran these numbers a couple of times, and I did notice an error the first time, so I stand to be corrected if any of these numbers are wrong. But I also ran them another time just to exclude the Sunwolves and the Jaguares. So if we're looking at purely the Australian teams, the South African teams, and the New Zealand teams, and the results are pretty interesting because the Sunwolves have lost all their games, so it's going to beef up the numbers for everybody else. So if you look at New Zealand versus Australian teams, 4 becomes 2. There've only been 2 games between New Zealand and actually Australian-based teams, and New Zealand's won 2 out of 2. So Australian Conference still sits at 0. For New Zealand versus South African teams, 2 New Zealand teams have beaten the Jaguares, so this moves to 7. And no Jaguares results have been up against New Zealand teams who ended in victory. So South African results versus New Zealand team still stays at 3. But the perhaps more interesting one, I think, is when we look at the Australians versus the Springbok guys against the South Africans. If you go Australian Conference versus South Africa, For Australia, 5 becomes 4. Because I think it was the Reds that went and beat the Jaguares. So we're cutting that one off the record. So it looks to give the South African conference the edge. But then when we take those Sunwolves results out of the equation versus Australian teams, it's only 1 win, and that was the Stormers over the Reds. All the other results for Australian versus South African conference wins have been against the Sunwolves. The Sunwolves toured South Africa and lost, and yeah, it's not been pretty reading for the Sunwolves, but that's a surprising result. It further kind of makes you wonder what's going on with the whole Australian versus New Zealand thing. But I guess that's one that'll probably, once it happens and an Aussie team gets a victory over a New Zealand team, then hopefully that kind of monkey will be off the back and things will get back to semi-regular service. But who knows, that may just depend on the Blues, because the Hurricanes and the Crusaders especially look pretty tough to beat at the moment. So yeah, these results will all kind of change as we go through. We've got the Waratahs and the Lions playing pretty soon, so that's another one that'll be an interesting one to see the balance. But yeah, just an interesting kind of conference thing. And yeah, the results were kind of a bit surprising for me anyway. What do you guys think? Is this a fair reflection of where the conferences are at, or is it just that there were kind of a few upsets early on, or a few results just didn't go teams' ways? So yeah, let me know your thoughts, and I'll talk to you guys again soon.